for the party.
Yes,
That'll just be,
it'll be hosted on our website and used for summary notes.
yeah, but it will go just to the participants, or will it be going wider? Just so everyone's aware.
It'll be on the DPI mapping website, so it'll be public.
Okay. So look, some of those restrictions mean that some people will be slightly limited in comments, and I understand that. If you want to have a follow-on conversation in a more private way, let us know because I understand this is for a bunch of reasons this is sensitive, and I think the background to today's discussion is really about safety and security, and I'll come to a little bit what does that mean from my perspective. But this is, as Mitchell and Christina said, look, I'm delighted the DPI team at UCL are hosting these, convening these sessions. I think it's a really important topic. Many of us who've been sort of in and around this discussion realize that a lot of us are needed to have an exchange of views and really help move this forward in an ecosystem way. So without further ado, let me just try and change slide. I think that works. So just a little bit about me. I've done 20 years in tech, spent a lot of time at IBM, but also been a chief security officer and been an advisor both to regulators as well as DPI Center and some of the projects that they do around the world, which are very interesting, and I've helped them a little bit in what should we think about in this domain. I also formerly was the National Review of Security for the UK government and authored something called the Coleman Report. So I think my first question as I start to get us to think about this, and I'm really leveraging for this discussion the document that the DPI mapping team have done. So, many of you be really familiar with that. So just as I go through that, it's deliberate. I'm going to leverage those materials to really start today's conversation. And I guess the question is, can we all agree on principles? And if I just go down to the next slide, I think that, if you look at the document itself, then there are a number of documents which are referenced in this document, which really talk to different principles that one might think, but they all really talk to common attributes. And so I just wanted to zero down on those common attributes because if we think about it, interoperability and extensibility, transparency, accountability and oversight, privacy, safety and security, and inclusion and non-discrimination. And I think, if we start to talk there, then when we're thinking about the security dimensions, we can think about privacy, safety, and security. We can also talk about resilience, which I think is in some of those pieces. And again, from a conceptual point of view, from a high level thing, a lot of these documents talk about governance, they talk about technology, security by design, they talk about ecosystem. The challenge, of course, is what does that really mean in practice and who does it relate to? So as we go to the next sort of layer of this, I referenced the great work that I'm sure many of you have been involved in the UNDP, the DPI safeguards framework, which has been developed and which is out and published. And so this slide just really picks off a couple of things from that document. It starts to break down risks in DPI into these three categories: the safety, the inclusion, and the structural vulnerabilities. And then it starts to layer this even further down into things like digital security, things like unsustainable or unsustainability, some technical shortcomings. But again, we're still pretty high level at this stage. And the question, of course, is how do we get this into a framework that can be applied, can be meaningful, and can have the conversation? And there are a couple of things which I think are really helpful. One is the conversation to the DPI life cycle and the consideration that we can conceptualize a DPI program, then we build it, then we effectively operate it and maintain it. But also, and by the way, I would probably add from a security dimension, we should think about decommissioning as well as commissioning, because in security, that's what we look at: disposal of media and disposal of assets. For those of us who have cell phones, mobile phones, or laptops, you will undoubtedly, I would think, have gone through more than one of them in your lives already, and therefore, how do you translate the data to the new platform, but also how do you decommission assets? And the same, I think, for DPI applies. And then some of those foundational principles on that. And I set this out as the context. So the principles of safety and inclusion, and what does that really mean to all of us, and how are we really translating that into operational procedures, and thinking about this in a life cycle of a DPI program, from the conception, how do you design it, how do you get people onboarded, how do you get people to use it, how do you get people to build trust in it and sustain it, and then how do you maintain that journey. And then as I dug a little deeper and looked at some of the things, then one of the things that the UN work recommends, and I think is helpful, is considering a cybersecurity framework for DPI. And obviously the words on this slide are replicated from that material. And I think it's worth just thinking about the left-hand column for a second. So first of all, who is the responsible authority that we're talking about, who should be worried about safety and security? So in this version, it's the government, but what should technology providers be associated with what they design as DPI tools and platforms, and where's their responsibility? What about the user dimension and some of the other? What about the funding bodies who also are supporting many of these DPI projects? What's their role? So as we get through to the debate, I'm looking forward very much to your sort of comments as to really, well, where do you think this starts to then deploy? And so from a government perspective, where does that come from, and all the stakeholders involved? Then a little bit about, well, which stage are we talking about? Because clearly security applies in each of those stages. And then thinking a little bit about, is it data security we're talking about by design, which is the one that's highlighted here? Is it infrastructure? Is it applications? Starting to really scope what we're talking about, whether we're talking about data centers, whether we're talking about locations, whether we're talking about physical security, as well as electronic and personnel security, who should have administrator access in those dimensions. And then finally, looking a little bit about digital insecurity and some of those fundamental weaknesses in technology. And then I went back to the document, which I think is really helpful and can guide us. And I looked at the questions that are currently designed by them. So the attributes 3.1 to 3.7. And I just let everyone read them for a moment, just refresh themselves on some of those. Some of them you'd be very familiar with them, but some of them may be not so familiar. You haven't looked at them, or you haven't looked at them recently. And I think the question, of course, is how do these elements, the 7 of them there, relate to making sure that we've addressed safety and security in terms of metrics and measurements that this document aims to achieve. And I think while it's a helpful start, hence why I'm really looking forward to the discussion, I think there's room for improvement. And I put that up mainly because it talks to certain things around ID, but it doesn't really talk to the wider safety and security issues. It doesn't really, for me, talk about resilience. And so, again, as we start to think about the principles, how do we then start to talk about metrics and measurements in this document? And then I sort of put this down into 4 areas that we might talk about. So if you're operating a cloud platform, for example, the concept of shared responsibility statements are pretty familiar to lots of people using enterprise clouds. What is the cloud provider responsible for? What is the person or the entity, the public or private body who's using the cloud also responsible for? And how do you get those statements articulated? So that's all to do with responsible parties and who is responsible for safety and security, and how does it map down to an operational layer. The life cycle stages we've talked about, and I think they're really helpful. And the operating principles. In my work in DPI, I look at this and some work that I developed from the Coleman report, which I wrote for the UK government, was really thinking about it in terms of governance, in terms of risk management, in terms of policy and operations, and monitoring, maintenance, and assurance, and really having 4 blocks. So again, kind of as we get down to this, and obviously security by design is part of policy operations, you can start to map down some of these concepts, encryption and other things which are referenced. Some of the privacy things that we would expect are part of that. Now, the then question is, okay, so if we can think about how we get to operating principles and how we can make sure we've got a consistent language and framework, can that help us speed the adoption of DPI? Because ultimately, the goal of security and safety is to enable infrastructure to be resilient, to be safe, to ensure those outcomes are there, but also enable these projects to move at pace to deliver the benefits they're intended. And so this then comes down to risk and opportunities, and how do we actually measure? There is a graph there for a reason, but how do we then start to measure both the risks, but also the opportunities from taking some of these steps, and what should we be measuring to ensure that? And I put the question, I'd like to really get against these 4 areas, your insights, what your work has informed, what are your insights that you've thought about, either in the general principle layer or really how you've mapped that out in terms of program. Or indeed, is this something that you're currently struggling with, either as a funder or as someone who's actually trying to implement DPI or support a community or a region or a central government doing that? And just in terms of what I've been doing, then, I've been doing effectively 3 things. I've been doing frameworks for security and resilience, and I've developed my 1.0 framework. And that does have some operational principles. And so it really is the beginnings of that DPI framework that is referenced in the UN. There are obviously lots of other frameworks, and many of them start from enterprise security, but they don't really work for DPI, and hence why I've had to go on that journey. If we want to have that discussion, we can also think about that. And finally, how do you measure and what metrics do you use to keep the communities aware and knowledgeable about the security of the system, but is meaningful to those stakeholders? And again, some of those certifications are often for a business to business environment, but not so good for a citizen engagement because frankly, they don't understand the metrics. And I think the final slide to me is, well, how can we start to think about advancing this discussion and moving it forward? And I think the deployments, so where we can find, and if there are examples either now or after the call where we think of where it's an opportunity to collaborate and bring stakeholders together, I and others, I'm sure, will be really happy to work together to think about doing case studies. And I've obviously talked to DPI Centre and others about doing this, about really getting more real world examples where we can help communities and regions through actually applying some of these principles and getting to a realistic model. But it'll also take probably a bit of funding. So if there are grant funding opportunities where we think about, then that'd be helpful. So case studies and funding, and then I think just keeping, a community which is vibrant, where we can have a really good discussion, but ultimately start to think through how it's developing in practice. Where should some of these assurance mechanisms end up? How can we assure, when it's open source, that it's maintained and secure in its life cycle? Some of the really tangible things that a lot of our community depend on. So I throw those as opening comments to really get to the discussion about, where are people's perspectives on this? Is this, real challenge? Have you got ideas and perspectives, and where do you think about those four concepts? Mitchell, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Nick. That was really great. I think there'll be lots for us to dig into, hopefully. A question that I've got for you directly whilst we give other people on the call a chance to kind of formulate their questions is whether you see resilience as an additional attribute for DPI, similar to the ones already existing in the framework that you discussed earlier, or whether it's like a feature of existing attributes themselves, and how you perhaps understand the tension between those two things.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think that eh, there is commonality in some of the pieces. So if you think about security as confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is the triad which has been used in the community for, well, a long time, let's say. I don't want to age myself too much, but a long time. Confidentiality is about getting information to be in the hands of those people who need it, and only those people, for the purposes that it's intended. So clearly, breaches and things where data gets to other people or accidentally sent to other people, or vulnerabilities where people can access data they shouldn't be able to, are clearly privacy related, and there's a whole set of things around privacy. When we come to the availability, then a lot of people have really focused on the privacy and the data protection, and much less on availability and resilience of systems. And so I think it's embedded in security, but what we're getting to in resilience, which I think is slightly wider, is originally you talked about whether the system was up or down, and and whether there was backup and whether there was recovery and those kind of dimensions, and that's where it obviously started. In today's world, resilience to me is the ecosystem that you need. So power and electricity, if it's a requirement, you're going to need those for compute power, a battery or a power source of some kind, telecommunications, etc. So you start to get into, well, but also there are dependencies. So we start to map out how that resilience has to happen, not just for the system they're using, but all the things which have to happen to be able to use those systems, all the parties which need to connect. And I think that's moving slightly broader to answer your question. So I think resilience as a concept is broader, but there are, as I say, connections to privacy, connections to all these concepts which come out of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I think as we get potentially more to AI, we'll probably spend a lot more time on integrity. Is it a deep fake? Is it a true version? Is it an agentic AI? What's the permission of this AI? How are we ensuring that the source of that data is accurate and it's not embedding bias? So I see that triad as continuing to be valuable, but I think the resilience, to your point, will have broader attributes as well. But I'd welcome others' views as well.
That's very helpful, Nick. Maybe I can go next. But again, just reiterating what Mitchell said in the chat box, if you'd like to speak up but not put your video on, just drop your question in the chat and one of us can pick it up for Nick. If you do want to go on video and you wish for us to stop recording, let us know. Nick highlighted at the beginning of this call that could be, it's a sensitive topic of discussion, and we'd like to encourage more voices. So my question, Nick, is all your input is well received, and also your critique of the framework we put together is very well received. My question is slightly more pragmatic. When governments are trying to adopt DPI, build ID systems, build payment systems, they're typically operating with existing benchmarks and frameworks for what secure data flows and exchange look like. It seems that DPI, because of the implied interoperability of data, offers more risks, and existing security frameworks might not be equipped to handle those emergent or new risks. Is that something that you found to be true in practice, or are we going about it entirely wrong and there should be a reassessment to each risk rather than at the framework level on how government should build more secure systems. I'm thinking data breaches that keep getting reported with ID systems at the vendor level or at the government level, and what that means for governments building more security systems.
Well, I think security challenges are here to stay for a foreseeable future. And obviously there is improvements. There are even new tools and techniques which can help improve the resilience of systems, coming back to Mitchell's point about, there might be things happening, but can you make them more resilient? Can we make the impact of them lessened and more and make platforms more sustainable? I think to answer your question, there's a couple of considerations. Do we need to make sure we have a framework? I mean, I think the UN wording is absolutely right. We will need that. It talks, obviously, it's a document about DPI. There is questions for me about what is DPI, and your documents, I think, have gone some way to define that, which is really helpful. I mean, I guess I'm saying is all public infrastructure might be the discussion. And I think the question is that, if you look at DPI funded projects, then you have a different set of constituent parties than you might have in other places. So if you take enterprise security, you have supply chain and you have all these things, but but then how do you deal with something which is a digital public good? And how do you deal with this? And how do you maintain, and where is open source? And so some of those dimensions practically, I think the answer is you don't need to go back to the fundamentals of the concepts, because I think, as I say, the concepts are all agreed. The framework is the bit where you set out those parameters. And as I say, the framework I use has 4, but there are different frameworks in different parts of the world for a lot of critical national infrastructure and other things. So you have the NIST cybersecurity framework, which has 6 pillars. You have you have the one, there's a UK framework for critical national infrastructure. There are a number of these, but they're designed for critical national infrastructure. The principles, again, make sense, but the translation, I guess the question is, and your question about how it applies in practice is the reality is that's where you have to, spend the funding, if you like, to really make sure that the principles we're talking about and the framework I'm talking about, having those elements in a DPI light, are applied and make sense in practice. And by that, I mean examples of a shared responsibility document between even the funding organization and the recipients and the stakeholders who are doing things as part of that funding process. How do you get that to operate across a life cycle? Is it that you expect the funders to maintain that infrastructure over the life cycle? Is it, as security vulnerabilities continue to evolve, whose responsibility for maintaining a free and open digital platform, and how do you get that baked into the discussion? As I say, in many different environments, in an enterprise, a lot of that is just part of running security. But we have a question, I think, so we have a hand up. So, Samet, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Can you guys see me?
We can see you. Welcome.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me on this. Just by way of introductions, I serve as an IISc fellow, University of Chicago's IISc fellow, serving with the National Health Authority of the Government of India, working on the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, which is India's national digital health ecosystem. I've worked on both the information security, governance, risk, and compliance side of things, as well as trying to figure out a way to implement secondary use of health data within a DPI framework, similar to actually what you guys have done in the UK with the Health Data Research UK. I think that's a very interesting initiative that I've been looking at. I don't particularly have a question. I just wanted to share my perspective on what you said. Specifically, I actually worked before this at the Takshila institution, where I had also written a paper on DPI security. I shared that with Christina. Uh, my understanding of how this works is slightly different, in the sense that whatever you said is true for the central components of DPI, in the sense that we need to understand how secure those components are, whether they embody all the principles that you spoke about. But I think a large part of DPI is actually what is built on top of it, right? If it's a road, if it's a roadway, if that's the analogy we want to draw, then it's about the rules that the cars on that particular road are following, and that's where you actually said the shared responsibility. For me, something like that is embodied in network policies of various DPI ecosystems, which in a lot of ways function as sort of quasi laws, where they're many at times are not actually backed by a legal legislation, but their enforcement is somewhat linked to uh, being kicked off the network, and that comes into effect or play once the network reaches network effects and scale, which I think is something that is not sort of discussed as much, that it is also sort of creating an alternative governance ecosystem within the larger ecosystem. The second thing is, of course, what happens when you build a DPI on top of another DPI? One example of this is that ABDM, for example, uses the Aadhaar uh, AUA KUA license to form the Ayushman Bharat Health ID, which is the main health ID for the ecosystem. What that means in practice, and at least this is what my observation is, in order for a participant to actually leverage the Aadhaar identifier, the security standards that they have to meet are much higher. Those are the UIDAI standards, which are at par with ISO 27001. Some parts of it are more specific to the UIDAI ecosystem, but they're still much higher. But any DPI ecosystem that's built on top of it, like ABDM, uh, the security compliance burden on the network participants is reduced. And that is because a lot of that burden is actually transferred to the central authority. In our case, that is ABDM, which essentially means ABDM is subject to the UIDI compliances, whereas all the other ecosystem participants are subject to a much less stringent web application security assessment, or WASA. And I think the third part, which I think was from my experience that I'd gathered, was um, threat intelligence. One thing I've noticed amongst these DPI ecosystems, which I think is important to be included in most other ecosystems, is some sort of centralized threat management, or whether that's a central SOC, whether the DPI administrator itself runs it or they've outsourced it. That is a question elsewhere. But what this also implies is that if a DPI is built on top of another DPI, the threat intelligence capabilities are also expanded. So those were some of my observations. I'd be happy to hear more about your opinion on the matter.
No, I think that, well, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for all of them. I think they're really valuable. I think that you said it in a really valuable way. I think, you build a platform and then what do you build on it? So, I touched on applications, but I think you've brought it to life about, how do people then, what is that shared responsibility statement, and how do you actually deploy that in practice? And I think the other thing you talked about is what I was the old way of describing codes of connections, right? And the COCO, for what it was called, is, and then that set out your point about the protocols that you had to have in order to be able to make the connection. And I think that some of that is embedded, as you say, in network management and how you do that. And the question sort of is, well, how scalable is that for a DPI infrastructure? And what do you understand? And more candidly, perhaps, how many people really get booted off when things go, they're not meeting the controls, and how you do that. So I think those are really important points of, some of the fundamentals that you need to start thinking. I think all the way through to, the DPI on top of the DPI. How does that governance really get done? And where is the appropriate check and balance? And certainly, I think in some systems where you have to do certain transactions, you think about enhancing security to get a better level of trust, but the reality for DPI, I think, is this is still really emergent. And then the final bit I really loved, which I haven't really spent a lot of time on, which I think is really an important topic, is what is a shared service kind of concept of, that threat intelligence, I think is, I mean, you talk about a SOC and Security Operations Center, and it just prompted me to think, well, what are those building blocks and where should they be? And what makes sense to do as a group or a common service, and what would an individual system or country or region have to do themselves? And I think that's a really useful, to think about where, for funders when they're doing, or even governments when they're funding projects, to think through what are the services they're going to need, and where should they be to be effective, and what linkages do they need in. And potentially, there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, about some of the things happening in different parts of the world, and which global pieces are you reliant on, whether it MITRE or whatever it is, in terms of actual practical capabilities, and how does that come to that? I think just such a rich discussion. I think, do others have comments? I think it's a really helpful set of things that we've just touched on.
There aren't any questions. I have one. I think diving more specifically into the UNDP framework when we're talking about responsibility, I'm curious, how have you seen kind of accountability playing out in a way that's visible to like the user, or is it much more like, I guess, the dynamics that exist there? Because I think one of the pieces that we've been looking at is how accountability is measured more specifically, but I think there's been a few different approaches. So curious on your perspective there.
There is a question in the chat, I think, so I'll come to that in a second. Maybe it was a comment. I think we're still early in the journey. That sounds a sort of a comment which doesn't have substance. But what I mean by that is, if you look at when that UN document came out, it's relatively recent, right? So it's not that the concepts are completely radically new, but the document and the approach that the UN has started to champion is new. I mean, it's in the last couple of years. So I think that it will take time for these discussions to really scale and be there. I think the second thing is we will need more evidence to ensure, and that's where I talk about the funding. From a funding point of view, we will need to find a consortium, I think, or a program which can really start to map real case examples. And I remember being with Christina and David last year, where we talked about this concept, but we talked about also one important variable, and I think just latches to the last comment and conversation we just had, which is it's about being inside the system rather than researching externally. So in other words, if you're really going to understand how the system is governed and performed, you have to be being able to do that research, but applied to specific projects with access to the projects and the stakeholders to see how it works in practice. Desk research from afar I found to be limited because it tends to be very high level and doesn't tend to see the operational use cases. I think those are the main points. I think the final thing, Michelle, which your comment touched on, is there's a dimension here of the individual user and their journey. And then there's also the region or the consortium or whichever. So there's a whole bunch of different stakeholders who may have different requirements. States may have a whole different set of requirements for managing resilience of an infrastructure and the security and the trust of that public infrastructure for the country or the region they're operating. And then the user will also have their own journey, or the people or the stakeholders who are implementing. So I think when we talk about the deployment of it, we also have to look at it through different lenses, because they are different. They add up, obviously, and they work together. And in a world where misinformation and trust needs to be earned constantly and reinforced, these kind of concepts of making sure people really are confident of the ability to use and deploy, and it is sustainable, it is resilient, it is built with all those protections in mind, and operates in a way which is in a risk managed way against it. All of that is really important, but then being able to translate it in a framework for a user to be able to understand. I've found that, for example, things like ISO 27001, which is the ISO standard for security, is really well known to security practitioners. Many enterprises around the world leverage it. It's a documentation approach of accreditation of an infrastructure. But if you then talk about to some of the stakeholder citizen groups, this is not the language that most people are talking about in ISO standards. So we have to work out which levels of trust we put and where and how we evidence them. And the frameworks and the implementation of those are really quite helpful for that. But then mapping it to meaningful measurements, as I always call them, is the next key step. So it's a long answer to your short question, but ultimately I think we're early on the journey. We need more research, and we need to fund a little bit more of that with real projects in mind, with leveraging some of the community here to make some of those tangible programs visible. I'm not sure it's actually huge amounts of work in terms of time, but I think it is more about being able to observe those, what I call the high level principles in my model, in practice and sharing them.
Thank you, Nick. I'll relate a question from Mateo Rodriguez now. I'll kind of summarize because there's a bit of context here. What Mateo is articulating is that he's found in the research that the Global Solutions Initiative have done a difference in emphasis between global majority and global minority contexts, between what's emphasized. So he's kind of found that like public trust and adoption is mostly a problem in European and Western countries, as opposed to global majority contexts where it's less emphasized. So the question following from that is, how can we translate these technical and abstract indicators that you're talking about, Nick, into something that the population understands and which can increase trust?
I think that's the crucial thing. I mean, I think if I simplify it, this is about getting people to understand the benefits of DPI and be able to engage and use them. And I think the answer to your question really is about the frameworks I'm talking about have a lens of public infrastructure in mind, and some of the concepts which come out of those UN papers and other sources. There are others, as per the document from UCL highlights, there are multiple, but they all talk consistent kind of language at the top level. And then the point about it is then embedding it into those pillars, which I have in the model, but there are other ways, I'm sure, of doing it, which then gives a practical model which can be applied to all use cases ultimately. I think you recognize that the level of resources and maturity can vary in those things. So, and potentially the legacy of what people are operating. So some cases they don't have some of these artifacts. In other cases they really do. And I think it's creating that framework which then people can self-populate and go, well, look, this is where I am. Either I have something and it's ready to go, or actually I don't have anybody available who can even understand what the shared responsibility means to us, and we are not going to be able to fulfill these roles, and being clear about then what support and guidance. So I think the framework and the concepts I've seen and the conversations I've had, it applies to both populations, potentially, of those who are less advanced and those more advanced, but ultimately then brings it back to which can be applied, and that's the bit which I think we just need more evidence to apply in a DPI context.
Thank you, Nick. I'm aware we're within the last 10 minutes of the session, and I think we've got 4 questions stacked. So if we kind of do a bit of a power round, perhaps, for the final few minutes. So I'll start off with a question from Rashi. Where does digital sovereignty fit in your framework, if at all?
Well, it's a really interesting question about what are the rules of the road and how does that need to translate to infrastructure and things. I think that it isn't specifically a security issue, but of course it has security and resilience and dimensions applied for it. So ultimately, I think the answer to your question is, what are the factors we need to scope in to those principles of operation, which then get translated into practice, which in the concept of the model says, well, I need to be able to do X, Y, Z, and I need to be able to do it in this place. If those are the restrictions, then you can start to bake them into operating principles. So it's really about that translation of these are the requirements of digital sovereignty, of X, Y, Z, and then this is what the operating model needs to come by. And I think the principles of the framework allow you to navigate that. And I'm really talking about, well, once you've defined what you need to achieve, then you achieve it. And in the process, by the way, you can test whether it, for example, needs to be an in-country or capacity, or whether actually it can be a neighboring capacity. Or in some cases, I've seen that actually a neighboring country is as a backup is probably less within the principles that they're trying to achieve, and they want to achieve something which is actually in a different geographic region, and that can be for earthquakes or other natural disasters that they're worried about in terms of that sustainability and resilience. So you have to define it at that operating principle level, and then you can get the operating model underneath.
Great. I think that also captures a mayor's follow-up question from Rashi as well. So I'll move on to a question from Mundia Morgan. How do we balance national security versus accountability and transparency requirements? And where does the balance start and end?
So I think this is where you have a clear framework, and you have to be, there will always be national security considerations and what you feel is important, and that will be down to countries and regions again to make those decisions about national security and what they share and how they evaluate. But ultimately, what we're really talking about is taking those threats and the concept of national security and baking it into an operating model. And that, for a government, there are lots of, that model really works well. You just need to capture the threat intelligence. You need to understand the risks. You need to design the system for resilience and be clear. For example, in the current piece about what components come from where and how your dependency is on minerals and other dimensions to make those ecosystems work. So this is not just, designing security. This is all about the security of and resilience of the whole of the DPI system. So really great question. And the models, I think, really can help us get there.
And we have 2 hands up as well with 5 minutes left. So Ritul, do you want to speak directly to Nick?
Sure.
Perfect.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Two, I think, broadly thoughts, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it as well. I was with the Benin and Rwanda team recently, who were on a delegation visit to MOSIP, and considering a lot of the DPI movement now that the countries are building on has an underlying DPG component to it that they want to use the open source softwares. And the question that came up was, how do you ensure the security of it? And then they broke down into 2, that there's the security aspect of the software itself, which MOSIP then has to do regular audits, checks, etc., publish it. Every successive update needs to be, and then the security of the deployment. And they say we're trying to work on the deployment side of it, and can we create sort of a country learning environment, etc., I think the Turing Institute had started the Cyber Observatory Network, where they share threats on national ID systems, etc. How do you see the two sort of, and the importance of it when a country sort of decides to adopt a DPG to build their digital public infrastructure? And the second is do you think like there is now a need to sort of start thinking of a holistic, like considering DPI is still fragmented in terms of IDs, very much like an ID bastion where most countries have home ministries running it, payments will be with the central banks, etc. To start thinking about holistic assessment and then publishing and then of threats of cybersecurity. In India, we have this organization called CERT, which is the Computer Emergency Response Team. In a lot of ways, it is very archaic in its mandate, and all the organizations that manage different DPI, would be UIDAI, which is the ID authority, which is the payment authority, or the data sharing entity. They all have murky mandates, and often they would not even report on if there are big data breaches, etc. So considering a lot of countries are now in the process of building roadmaps or actually starting to set up entities, how do they position this? Like, is there a need for a certain kind of for a DPI, considering these are national systems of critical importance? Yeah, by the way, I'm just to introduce, I'm Ritul. I work with the Digital Impact Alliance, DIAL.
No, thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll be very quick in my response, but happy to follow up afterward. I think that, you ask a great question. So I think that this is where the UN framework is very helpful, because what it's really saying is, well, you can use digital public goods, but you still, as the government or the region who's doing the program, or the private, whoever is doing that DPI program, is ultimately going to need a cybersecurity framework to be able to drive that outcome. So your answer is really, yes, you can have, and I think you articulate very well. Well, look, I've got this platform, and what's this platform? What's this thing I'm going to use? It's digital public good. This is great. Well, yes, you can get the assurances, and you should get the assurances from that. And I think we need to be clear about what assurances would be helpful to maintain confidence and trust. But ultimately, the bit about driving it at the holistic level with the cybersecurity framework is where you do the checks and balances to make sure that. And just to build on your, it really comes back to CERTs are fantastic organizations, and they have a really good communication network around the world. So I think that you would build on things like that, but ultimately certs do a specific role in a specific context in many cases. And the question really is, what is the bodies we need to be able to share at a holistic level? And that's a conversation whether the certs become those environments of the future and develop into those fuller capabilities, or whether we're going to need a few things. And I think your point about a lot of other ecosystem players, I mean, there is lots of cooperation, but ultimately, I think we will succeed where we have this approach where a standardized framework can get us metrics and measurements which will allow the flow of conversation more easily and the exchange of data. And that needs to broaden beyond the current certs probably to achieve that.
Thank you, Nick. I'm aware we're at the hour, but there are still some hanging questions. So I suppose, do you have capacity to stay on for another 5 minutes, Nick, or shall I take? Great.
If we do 5 more minutes, if everyone's willing to stay, I'll do that. That'd be happy to. And as I say, I'm happy to have the conversation via Mitchell and the team to directly have conversations with me, or again, do another follow-up session if this is really interesting.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. Okay, so I'll start with Eric then. Do you want to go? Eric?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Just to quickly react, I think this has been a wonderful discussion. And I think that there's some perspective that I have not heard being mentioned, which is the governance requirements from the host country perspective. Which makes sense because most of these frameworks, they have been mentioned, the NIST, the ISO 27001, as it was already said, they're good for business to business environments and they give assurance. but then in government, there's a whole lot of additional requirements. And just tapping into the last comment in terms of ensuring that there's governance across agencies, there's a need to have checks and balances that are organizational and that are supported by laws. And so having a cybersecurity framework, yes, is necessary, but it's really at the end of the day, it's not just a technical IT project. It's also a governance problem, and it's much more complex when you consider the structure of government and how difficult it is to implement and design those laws and enforce them. Over.
Yeah, Eric, I totally agree. I mean, and the first pillar of my framework is about governance. And I think, we've talked about it. It is wider than the technology. It is about how processes and systems operate and the wider concept. So I think that's very well made. And I think you reinforced that the other helpful comment was really that, that some of the existing frameworks that have been developed are not really in the context of what we're looking at here, which is why we're going to need to, as we deploy more of these systems and we want to get them faster, accelerated, and more resilient, which I think is our goal, and serving people better, then we're going to have to spend a little bit more time on, focusing on this issue and make sure we've got those answers for the stakeholders.
Thank you, Nick. And finally, another question from Samyak.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for taking my other question. So in the course of the conversation, I had a few more thoughts that I thought I would share. First is simply about that most DPI ecosystems that I'm familiar with follow a model of ex-ante compliance with regards to security, that before onboarding, you require to show evidence of being compliant to a particular security standard that the DPI administrator basically sets. One thing that I have personally noticed is that really hurts adoption. And it's also because any entity that's integrating into a DPI is sort of competing with an entity that's not integrated, not subject to the same amount of compliance burden, not subject to the same requirements, both even in terms of just the effort required, as well as the money required to implement those security safeguards. Right. And that comes down to a larger question. So in India's case, we just had the DPDP pass last year, but most DPI ecosystems go back way far beyond that. The question I have is simply, should DPI ecosystems, one opinion I've heard is participating in a DPI ecosystem is compliance by the mere act of participation. So if you comply, if you join the ecosystem, you're complying with the law. But another view that I've heard is that DPI ecosystems should sort of push the envelope with regards to security standards, because they're dealing with slightly more intrinsically sensitive areas. What is your view on the matter, and how do you think we should view these things? And I think the second question what Ritul raised was also a very interesting one, with regards to, and I think the threat reporting, which also goes into threat intelligence to an extent. I know that in the ABDM case, we are monitored by CERT, but we are also designated critical information infrastructure. That means the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center is also monitoring us. I just wanted to understand what your view is with regards to how should all DPIs be declared CIIs so that they adhere to a higher standard. I understand that something that, for example, like ONDC, which just deals with e-commerce, probably doesn't warrant that kind of designation. But all the others that I can think of, whether it's payments, whether it's health, whether it's energy, do seem to warrant that. I would love to know your view on the matter.
Well, and again, it's a really wonderful set of observations again. And I think there's I'll respond briefly. I think some of it probably needs a little bit longer because there's a lot of complexity to a simple question sometimes. The first thing for me is how do you make an intelligent customer? And what I mean by that is capacity building in the ministries, in the regions, in the people, in the civil servants that we work with in different parts of the world, to really give them the tools and capability to be, not to make them security managers and not to make sure that they have to be able to update the firewall and whatever protection they're putting on devices. This is not about that. This is about making them educated and capable of making informed risk decisions. And I think part of the discussion about, well, you can get something, well, it's, but it doesn't, you go faster because it doesn't have any of these checks and balances, or you do this, is really ultimately about empowering our stakeholder community to be able to operate and manage their risk, because ultimately they're the ones who are responsible for it. So I think that's one point. I think then the question about classification and use of different DPIs and whether the threshold raises, I think it always will come down to contextualization of what that system is doing and who it's doing it for, and I think that's again where the framework I'm talking about really, the governance, the risk management, and obviously the things I have under each bucket, really getting the stakeholders to go, okay, yeah, I've got it. I've thought it through, and this is where, and this is my resistance. And there are methodologies that I leverage. For example, I trained in the FAIR certification of factor of information risk quantification. Some of those techniques are helpful to kind of go, well, how much security do we need, and what's the threat we're facing, and is it proportionate? And by the way, is it a risk decision that person can afford themselves? So I think there is a lot of really good stuff to be leveraged there, or tools and concepts. But this is really about pulling it down from the sort of, we believe in safety and security, to having an operational model, to having a stakeholder who is able to have an informed discussion. And that may mean helping them and really leaning in the first set of things and making it comfortable for them, but ultimately saying, well, look, you can use a digital public good, but here are the 3 questions you might want to ask. Where is this threat intelligence going to come from? How am I going to discover whether other people have had the vulnerabilities? And by the way, who's going to be paying for the system to be maintained and updated? Is it something that I'm going to have to do through a license or something? So, again, moving it sort of from the high level to an operating model to clearly outcome questions, which sort of brings me all the way back to what I hope we'll be able to do as a community is really help in the DPI map about be able to deploy those operating, get that evidence base, and then bring back more informed questions, which go, well, look, these are the things that in probably 3.0, Christina, I'm afraid to say, not in 2, that we can turn, David and others. But I think there'll be more people on this call who can really contribute and make a difference to that and test some of the, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, because I think we as a community can really test each other and build something great. So thank you for the questions and really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, I think this has been a really enriching discussion for everybody. Thanks for everybody as well who contributed questions. Christina, is there anything else before we close off?
No, I think what I said in chat, I think a part 2 of this discussion is definitely in order. If there's questions that were left out that you couldn't bring up in this community chat, write to us, and we can see what part 2 can be about, and try and get next time again a few weeks down the line. But we really appreciate you being here, Nick, and thanks for being such a great soundboard for all things security and trust. Looking forward to staying in touch.
Thanks all, and thanks Christina and Mitchell for doing what you do, and David as well. So really lovely to be with you all.
Amazing. Thanks everyone. See you again next time.